Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Yaron Ayalon, Director of the Yaschik Arnold Jewish Studies Program at the College of Charleston, and Associate Professor of Jewish and Middle Eastern Studies. And welcome to our first event of the fall semester 2020. And this semester, as you all know, is a bit unusual, and our events will be online only. We're very excited to have Peter Beinart with us tonight, with just a few points of order before we'll get to our business. First, this meeting is being recorded. It's also streamed live on Facebook. We will have time to ask our speaker questions, but for the sake of efficiency, you will all be muted, and questions should be submitted via the chat at any time during this talk. In fact, you can start typing them now if you wish. We will try to get to as many of these questions as our time permits, and we will combine several similar questions into one, and some of them might be edited for clarity and brevity. So I'd like to invite you all just to check out our many other exciting events for this semester by going to our Facebook page. I'll put all the details in the chat for everyone to see. And you can also email us if you would like to be added to our list, so you would get the Zoom links for all the other events. Now I shall hand this over to Professor Joshua Shanes, who is Associate Director of the program and Director of the Arnold Center for Israel Studies. And he will introduce our speaker and conduct this event. So Josh, please.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you, Peter, for joining us, and for everyone. It's wonderful to see so many names, familiar and some unfamiliar names. It's just a delight to be here all together as best we can under these new circumstances. Most of you, I think, know who Peter is, but I'll remind you that Peter is one of the most celebrated and in-demand speakers in the Jewish world today. He was an editor of the New Republic, of Republic magazine of blessed memory, and also an editor or contributor to pretty much every leading journal in America and Israel since then, The Atlantic, Daily Beast, Haaretz, The Forward, The New Yorker, and so on and so on. He first came to Charleston, it was 10 years ago, Peter, I don't know if you remember or not. After your first article that really brought you to fame on the crisis of liberal Zionism, which was the name of one of his 3 books, which argued that the discord between liberalism and Zionism was going to have pernicious effects down the road if it wasn't addressed, especially for young American Jews. And since then, he was laboring intensely for liberal Zionism until this year. And this year, as all of you know, if you looked at our website, we posted links to Peter's articles, the longer version in Jewish Currents, where he's also an editor, and a shorter version in the New York Times, where he argued that the time for the two-state solution is over, and that the best way forward is to think about one-state options. The way we're going to proceed, I know that knowing many of you as I do, that you will have a lot of questions, and knowing Peter as I do, I can assure you one of his many wonderful qualities is his patient and calm ability to respond to questions with erudition and knowledge and patience above all else that really is unparalleled. Those who know Peter know he's also quite the mensch, so it's really a delight. And Peter, I warn you, I suspect, knowing my audience, they'll have some tough questions for you, and I'm sure you're excited to take them on. So I'll turn it over to Peter for, excuse me, about 5-10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So please, Peter.
Sure. Well, thank you very, very much for having me. Charleston has a special place in my heart. We have some very, very dear family who live in Charleston, and I think I even see some members, people in the crowd who have family connection to, which is a wonderful thing. And I'm also a great fan of Josh's, and so really it's an honor to be with him. You know, I was raised to believe in the absolute necessity of a Jewish state. My family is South African, and I think that created a sense of the fragility of diaspora life. Perhaps it was a little bit stronger in my family than in families that have been in the United States for a long time. And to add an even additional twist to that, my maternal grandmother, who was kind of the matriarch of the family, was not only a South African, but a Sephardi South African who had been born in Alexandria, Egypt, and grew up in the Belgian Congo. And throughout my life, she made it extremely clear to me that there was no country, very much including the United States, in which Jews should ever rely, and that any country was a dubious long-term bet other than the state of Israel, where her brother had actually moved to from Alexandria pre-state. I held to those views very strongly, and there's still a strong part of me that feels them. And yet I would say, starting about 20 years ago, when I first started to go to visit to the West Bank. I mean, I've been to Israel, quite a few times as a kid growing up, but I had really, I'm ashamed to say, really spent almost no time with Palestinians. And starting more than 20 years ago now, to spend time in the West Bank was, I would say, the beginning of a intellectual and maybe more, kind of journey that has led me to places that I really did not expect to be. And it started with simply seeing the lived reality of people who live under Israeli control without basic rights. It's one thing to know kind of in the abstract that, okay, the Palestinians in the West Bank, they kind of live under Israeli control, but they don't have citizenship. They can't vote for the Israeli government. It's a little bit abstract. But then you think about essentially what someone's life is like when the state that dominates their life has no responsibility to them, right? It's not exactly the same as it was, let's say, for Black Americans during Jim Crow. But ultimately, if you think about what the problem for Black Americans in Jim Crow was basically the state wasn't accountable to them because they couldn't vote, right? So in any conflict with white people about property, vis-a-vis the law, no matter what, that basically you always end up on the losing end. And yet African Americans were at least theoretically citizens of the United States, right? Even though they couldn't actuate it by voting. Palestinians in the West Bank are not even theoretically citizens of the country in which they live. And when you stand in villages that are slated for demolition, where the basically bulldozers are going to come any day and knock down every building, every structure in that village because people can't get a permit, because who needs to give them a permit? They're not citizens. No one owes them anything, right? That was, I suppose, the beginning of a journey that ultimately took me here, and it was a journey in which, and I'll try to wrap this up, I guess, because I don't really. It seems like maybe I'm started on a longer road than I should. But I thought the way to solve this problem was the two-state solution, right? Because the Palestinians would have their own state, they could be citizens of their own state. What they would do with it, who knows? You never know. But they would have their own state. They'd be citizens of some place. Right, they'd have their own place, and it would be, and I was arguing this for many, many years, and and in all these years that I was arguing for it, the Palestinians were making mistakes. I'm not claiming that they're saints or they're blameless, but ultimately, no matter what the Palestinians did, whether they attacked violently or didn't attack violently, whether they were quiescent or not quiescent, no matter whether it was labor or the Quds, Israel kept on essentially subsidizing, paying more and more Israeli Jews to move into the West Bank. And so when you look back at the history of the debate about the two-state solution, you can go back to the early 1980s and you see people like Meron Ben-Veniste, the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, or the Israeli writer Amos Elon, or the Palestinian mayor of Bethlehem, Elias Frege, and they say things like, we can't create a viable Palestinian state if there are 100,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank. And we could go into the details of why, in particular, it makes it so difficult to create a state that can meet the kind of basic minimums for Palestinians. But the top line is that we now have 650,000 settlers, Jewish settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. I think every time I've gone and looked and seen on the ground, it's not just the number of people, it's the massive infrastructure. Israel built inaugurated its most recent medical school last year in the West Bank, right? This does not look anything like a temporary project. And I was going out there again and again in events like this, although they would be in person, and kind of raising the flag for the two-state solution. And to be honest, I was beginning to, it wasn't sounding right in my ear anymore. Have you ever had that experience? Like you argue and argue and argue something, and all of a sudden, in a sense, you're not convincing yourself so much anymore. And I felt like, wait a second, I may be trying to convince other people of something in which I have quietly lost faith. I also began to kind of, I think, have an understanding that perhaps I didn't before, that even if there were a Palestinian state be created, it would not solve some of the fundamental problems of 1948 that we as Jews maybe often don't really want to reckon with, and particularly the Palestinian refugee question, which we can talk about more. So I was a little bit of a dead end, because if you're a writer, the thing about being a writer, in my experience, is, and as public speaker, is you can be wrong, and I've been wrong about so many things, but it's one thing, you can't go out and, if you say things that you know are wrong, or you don't believe them, then ultimately you shouldn't be in that business. There's something fundamentally unethical about that. And I began to feel like I was reaching a bit of a dead end. And so I had a lot of time on my hands because of COVID. And I thought, you know what, I'm just gonna basically try to read in a lot of different areas. And I'm going to talk to a lot of people. And I'm going to try to see whether there's another idea that can make sense to me. And out of that project came this essay called Yavna, which had a shorter version in the New York Times, which tries to argue for equality within one unit of Israel-Palestine, either in a confederation, which we talk about, or a federation that's a binational state. And it partly came out of a lot of reading of Palestinian writing, but it also came out of looking at the history of Zionism and trying to see it from a different angle. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to throw out just one general question first, and then I'll give the everyone a few more minutes to start gathering other questions. I'm guessing our audience is going to be divided between two sets of people, and I haven't polled them. This is a guess, but I'm guessing a number of them are sort of liberal Zionists who say the only way forward is two states. One state can never work for X, Y, or Z reasons, and therefore we have to just wait. And we can't, the idea of all of a sudden annexing the West Bank formally and giving citizenship to all the Palestinians who live there, this is a recipe for civil war, et cetera, et cetera. We have to wait for two states. And I'm guessing a number of the members of the group out there now are more to the right of the liberal Zionists, and they say, I don't want two states, but I also sure as hell don't want one state where everyone is all of a sudden made a citizen. Instead, they want to do something along the lines, I imagine, of what Trump was proposing, where Israel will take 30% of the West Bank, most of the empty land, and leave the Palestinian populations in the territories that remain. And I wonder if you could sort of speak generally, and I'm certain that everyone's going to gather more specific questions, but I wonder if you can speak generally to those two groups, how you respond to each one.
Sure. So I guess I would say, let me start with the folks who believe in a two-state solution, who believe there should be a Palestinian state. I would say, at the very bare minimum, I think I would hope that I would make the point to them that if you want a Palestinian state to be created, simply sitting back and waiting is not going to be a good strategy, because there is no, the idea that there's a status quo, I think, is a myth. In what's actually happening is that the Israeli government is essentially, as I said, through a whole series of subsidies, essentially making it cheaper for Jews to live in the West Bank. This has been a massive government subsidy. I mean, if you look at, again, just take like the ultra-Orthodox population, for instance, the Haredi population, which has massive housing problems because they have so many children, right? What the Israeli government basically did was build two huge settlements, Beitar Elit and Modi'in Elit, for that population, for the next generation who could not live in Jerusalem or Bnei Brak, right? Housing, industry in various ways, education, and a whole series were cheaper in the West Bank. And so Israelis, some settlers want to move there for ideological reasons because they believe it's biblically precious. But Israel is basically continuing this process of encouraging people to move into this territory. And this is not empty land, right? Or to say, if it is empty land, the places that are empty land are only empty because Palestinians are barred from moving there and building there, right? If they try to build in this empty land, like in Area C, then their villages, houses get bulldozed. But oftentimes, if it's not, it's basically land that often Palestinians own privately, right? It's their land, and the land gets taken from them. The state takes it and then doles it out to settlers, right? So I would say, if you want to keep the two-state solution alive, it seems to me and I believe, unfortunately, that the clock has already struck midnight, but maybe you believe it's already only 11:55. Then if you want to keep at 11:55, you have to stop the settlement process. Because it is moving that clock closer and closer to midnight. Again, if you believe that a Palestinian state needs to have any basic viability, right? If it needs to be able to do the thing that a state needs to do, it needs to be contiguous. It needs to be able to provide people with basic opportunity for prosperity. It needs to have a capital in East Jerusalem, right? Because if you don't have a capital, Palestinian state doesn't have a capital in East Jerusalem. It's like setting, I mean, I don't know how many of you are New Yorkers, probably quite a few of them. So you'll get this analogy, right? A Palestinian state without a capital in East Jerusalem is like a state in Westchester that can't get to Manhattan, right? It's basically, it doesn't have access to its natural commercial capital. So that's for the two status. For the people who believe that Israel should control basically all the territory, and the Palestinians underneath Israeli control, maybe we try to be nice to them, but they don't basically have any basic rights in the sense that they should have the right to be the citizen of the state in which they live, right? Which is a pretty, I would say two things. First of all, what I would deeply encourage you, if you have the opportunity, post-COVID, God willing, when this plague ends, to go and see for yourself what it looks like. It's not too dangerous to go, believe me, totally possible to go. There are lots of lovely, nice, young Israeli Jews who will take you and show you what it looks like. And it's important for you to see what that looks like on the ground, right? Again, because it's one thing to know in the abstract, but when you see it on the ground, I will just say for myself, it's horrifying. It's horrifying to see the way what it means for people to live every single day of their lives, every second of their life under a government that can do anything it wants to them. And it's not that Israelis are not lovely people. Israelis are lovely people. It's a basic fundamental reality that when people have no rights vis-a-vis the state that controls their lives, terrible, terrible things happen. The second thing I would say, and I believe, again, Jewish tradition is an ocean, it is everything and its opposite. So I'm not trying to suggest there's some essence to Jewish tradition, but I would just say that it is worth noting about Jewish tradition that Bnei Israel are people who were born into who are created as a nation in slavery, right? The book of the Jewish family, Abraham's family, Yaakov's family is in the book of Bereshit in Genesis, but Jews only become a nation, right? Am Yisrael, right? In the book of Shemot, in the book of Exodus, in slavery, and that's part of the reason that we're told, according to the Talmud, that it says 36 times in the Torah that we remember the heart of the strangers because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. And it seems to me that is not consonant with holding millions of people with fewer rights than a Black person in South Carolina in the 1930s. And the last point I would make is, just from a more self-interested point of view, holding people without basic rights, this is a point that Martin Luther King often made, is a form of violence. It is violence. And if you impose daily violence on people, sooner or later, they're going to respond with violence. And Israel-Palestine is a small place, right? Gaza is not far down the beach from Tel Aviv. The West Bank is not far away from Israeli population centers. What you inflict on Palestinians in some form or another will come back to haunt you, right? Just one small example, right? Gaza, the UN says that Gaza is now unlivable. It is unfit for human habitation, right? It's not, as I said, it's not far away from Ashdod and Ashkelon, right? Already you're finding that the sewage being pumped out of Gaza because they don't have enough electricity to treat the wastewater is coming and forcing them to shut down desalinization plants in places like in Ashdod and Ashkelon, right? You can't keep these people living in a hellhole and think it's not going to come back to you in some way. We're all in some, as King said, we're in this inextricable garment of destiny, particularly for people who live cheek by jowl as they do in Israel, Palestine. So I'll stop.
That's great. Thank you. Yaron, are you ready with some slides or should we continue?
Yes, definitely.
So just to remind everyone, please continue to enter your questions. Feel free to really challenge our speaker. Put them in the chat box and Yaron will gather them together into a PowerPoint presentation, ongoingly growing PowerPoint presentation. Yaron, you can go ahead and share your screen for the first question.
That requires some multitasking, but let's see how I can.
I have perfect faith in you.
All right. So we have a few questions. Some of them expectedly repeated themselves. So I sort of condensed them into the same question. So the first, why did you include references to South African apartheid? in your recent essays, do you expect to be taken seriously with that approach?
Right. I don't know whether I expect to be taken seriously for a whole range of reasons, but let me just say something about this. I mean, the essay tries to essentially look at a variety of different cases in which you have a political system in which one group of people has rights. They have the right to vote for the government that controls them, for instance, and another group doesn't, and then tries to look at what happens when the right to vote is given to everybody, essentially, when there's political equality. So it does talk about South Africa and the transition from apartheid to post-apartheid. It also talks about Northern Ireland, talks about the United States after segregation. I talk also about binational states like Belgium. Apartheid, there are to the degree, on the question of to the degree that the apartheid analogy fits Israel-Palestine, I would say that I think it's worth distinguishing between Israel inside the Green Line and Israel in the West Bank. So the inside the Green Line, in Israel proper, Israel within its borders that were created in 1949, Palestinian citizens, or what we tend to call Arab Israelis, have the right to vote, and they are citizens of the state. Now, they do suffer a kind of deep structural discrimination. So for instance, when Israel forms its governments, Israel has had there's another question, wait a second.
No, we'll get to that, sorry.
Okay. Sorry, you're telling me to speed up.
No, go ahead.
Take your time, this is important.
So Arab Israelis are not in, I think, the equivalent situation of Black South Africans, because Black South Africans under apartheid did not have the right to vote. Whereas Arab Israelis do have the right to vote. They're Arab members of the Knesset. There's even an Arab on the Supreme Court. Now, it is important to remember that there is a deep form of structural discrimination even against those Arab Palestinian citizens. One of the ways it's reflected is that there's been a strong norm in Israel that when you create your Knesset majority, right, you need 61 seats in the Knesset out of 120 to form a government, that government is not legitimate unless it's created only with Jewish seats, right? Only with Jewish parties. So the Arab parties, the Palestinian parties, are kind of locked out of political power in Israel. There are also some other kind of fundamental questions, like for instance, when Israel was created and there were 700 or 800,000 Palestinians made refugees, even those who remained inside Israel and became Israeli citizens, the Arab Israelis, were still not allowed to come back and reclaim their property. So there is a fundamental discrimination, but I do think it's different than apartheid in South Africa. On the other hand, in the West Bank, there you have a situation where, again, you have two groups of people: Palestinians, who are the majority in the West Bank, and Israeli Jews. The Israeli Jews are citizens of the state. They vote for the government. They live under Israeli civil law. They have free movement. They can go back and forth across the Green Line. The Palestinians in the West Bank are not citizens of Israel. They cannot become citizens of Israel. They don't have the right to vote for the government that controls their lives. It's true, there is this thing called the Palestinian Authority. We can talk about it more. But the Palestinian Authority is not a government. It has no army. It's really Israel's subcontractor. It does the tasks that Israel would rather not do directly. These Palestinians in the West Bank live under military law, not civil law. They don't have basic due process, and they don't have free movement. They need the Israeli military to give them permission to move around. So in that basic sense, there is a similarity to apartheid. The core of apartheid was basically having two racial groups under a completely different legal system, one in which had basic rights, the other which didn't. Now, Jews and Palestinians are not a race, they're ethno-religious groups, but you have essentially two groups of people living in the same territory under a different law. And that does, it seems to me, have significant resemblances to apartheid. I talked in my piece about all of these different cases, not because I think they're identical in any way to Israel-Palestine. Every case is different, but because I wanted to try to look at examples of what happens when you go from a situation of political inequality, which exists today, to political equality. So whether that needs me to be taken seriously, I don't know, but.
That was great, thank you. Yaron,
yes,
please.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, since I put up this slide, there have been a bunch of questions that all essentially ask the same thing in different versions. And that was also a question I wanted to ask. So before I go to the next slide, I'm just going to ask it now. And this has to do with the practicality of what you are describing in your essays about that solution. In other words, and I'm really paraphrasing, people ask this in different ways. Some in how shall I say, in a sharper language than others. And some were not even questions, they were really insults that I will spare from you. But let's just say this. Let's talk about, if we can, about the practicality of this. There is, as you say, in one of the two essays, I forget in which one you say this, that whether it's a state or not, you do want Jews to have a place that's a home for Jews, a place where they feel safe. Now, the question is fine. Let's say that the two-state solution, if we accept that midnight has passed and it's no longer possible to go for that, or at least for now and for the foreseeable future, it's not possible. How would it work? Because when I look at this and, I try to see, okay, well, what would be the solution? As someone who spent half his life there, I served in the IDF and I was I could say a political activist back in the day when I was younger and more naive, perhaps. So I really care about this place, and I care about, and many people who comment here say the same things. How would it work today? That is, when I look at this, I say, maybe it can work, the suggestion that Jews and Palestinians can live together and accept each other in the same state and feel safe and everything is going to be like Switzerland. But maybe that's going to take another 50 years. How is that going to work now? How would you envision this to be not a desired solution, but a practical solution right now?
And Peter, if I can just piggyback on that for 1 second, maybe think about some comparisons. I don't know, in one of the essays you talked about Lebanon, I think, if memory serves correct. So I'm sure a lot of people think, oh, what do we need another Lebanon? We surely don't want that. Right. So if you could think about that as well as part of your answer, I think you'll kill a number of birds with one stone.
Sure. So look, I start from the assumption that there is one state now, that Israel controls all of the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. As I said, the Palestinian Authority is just Israel's subcontractor. If Israel can send its army in and arrest any single person anywhere in the West Bank anytime it wants, it can arrest the members of the leaders of the Palestinian Authority, which it does sometimes, right? And I also start from the assumption, and we can talk about it in more detail if you want, that Israel controls the Gaza Strip, right? Even though there are no more settlers there, that Israel controls access in and out of the Gaza Strip by air, land, and sea. If you are born in the Gaza Strip, your name has to be entered into a computer database. It has to go into the Israeli computer database system, and that determines whether you can leave or enter, right? Even the part of Gaza that borders on Egypt, Israel still has to give you permission to enter or leave. So Israel controls the Gaza Strip in the same way the United States would control Canada if the United States controlled access to Canada by air, land, and sea. And basically, someone born in Canada, their ability to go in and out was determined by whether America said they could or not. Israel also, by the way, actually controls a perimeter inside the Gaza Strip from which it bans Palestinians from entering, the kind of perimeter of the Gaza Strip. So anyway, that's my working assumption, right? That there is one state now. And this one state is basically roughly 50-50 Jews and Palestinians, right? So the question for me is, based on what we know from political science research about a whole range of different case studies, and there's a lot of data that we have about this, what is more likely to be stable and peaceful? A binational state, right? By binational, I mean that this country has two groups that consider themselves nations, right? Jews and Palestinians, right? What tend to be more peaceful and more stable? Binational states or deeply divided societies where one group is basically denied political rights and doesn't really have much influence over the government that controls it, or binational states where both sides actually have the right to be represented in government. And I think on that, and I try to present some of that evidence in the longer piece, the evidence is overwhelming that binational states, deeply divided states, are much more peaceful and stable when everyone has a voice in government. Again, America is very different than Israel-Palestine in a lot of ways. We're not a binational state, but we are a deeply divided state, right? And you could ask the question: would America be a more stable or less stable, more peaceful or more or less peaceful place if we had never given African Americans the right to vote? Right? Not just what would it be like, not just for African Americans, but for white people, right? So the evidence that we have overwhelmingly is that when people have the right to vote for their government that controls their lives and express themselves politically, their resort to violence goes down because they have a peaceful way of expressing their concerns. And one of the points that I make in my piece is that one of the pieces of evidence you can look to for this is actually the behavior of Arab Israelis, right? What I call Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? Why is there so little violence or terrorism by Arab Israelis, even though they have much more access to Israeli Jews than do Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza? I mean, I think 50% of Israel's pharmacists are Arab Israelis, maybe 25% of its doctors, right? This is, but because this population has the ability to be represented, even with discrimination to some degree in its government, that has a real effect on its willingness to recourse to violence. Now, in terms of different binational states, the reason I don't think that Lebanon has had a very tortured and unhappy history, but I argue in my piece that I think Lebanon is not a good example for Israel-Palestine for several reasons. First of all, we know from political science research that the stability of a democracy correlates in partly with per capita income, right? Israel has a per capita income of 3 times Lebanon and much higher, than other Arab countries like Jordan and Egypt. It also has a literacy rate, both among Israeli Jews and Palestinians, which is in the high 90s, where it's in the high 70s in the Middle East as a whole. And literacy also correlates very strongly with stable liberal democracy. Israel also has other advantages, right? It has a set of functioning institutions, right? An independent Supreme Court, independent press, a functioning bureaucracy, a military that stays out of politics. One of the things that you saw in post-apartheid South Africa is that it was a great advantage to post-apartheid South Africa to have these institutions. They were essentially only functioning for one group of the population, white South Africans, or this case, mostly for Israeli Jews, but they were very, very valuable when this society became equal for everyone. When I was growing up, people were constantly telling me, can't tell you how many times, post-apartheid South Africa never will be able to succeed as a democracy. After all, look at all of the other countries in Africa and what's happened to them. My grandmother, as I said, she grew up in the Belgian Congo. She told me my entire life, look at what happened in the Belgian Congo. Look at what's happening in Zimbabwe. Look at what happened in Nigeria. But in reality, there was a problem with that. People were making a big kind of generalization based on race or culture. To understand Israel-Palestine, you have to look at the specifics. As I said, the GDP, the per capita income, the institutions that it has. Lebanon, besides being a much poorer country, is also a country that is a very, very weak state. Lebanon was first destabilized, I hate to say, by the Palestinian refugee question, right? The movement of Palestinian refugees into a society that was precariously divided between Sunni Shia and Maronite Christian was itself very destabilizing, right? And then you have a weak state that was preyed upon by both Syria and Israel. I will remind you that Israel invaded Lebanon more than once, but in a big way in the early 1980s. Israel-Palestine would be a much stronger state, much less likely, I think, to be invaded and preyed upon by its neighbors. So for that reason, I actually think that Belgium, Northern Ireland, even Bosnia, which I didn't get a chance to talk about in my piece as much as I would have liked, are actually better models for a binational state than Israel-Palestine. But again, I'll go back to the point I started with. You don't have to believe that everything is going to be completely sweetness and light. My argument is that it's better than the alternative. And my argument is that the alternative is what exists now, which is a binational state in which one side is largely disenfranchised.
Thank you so much. As promised, erudite and concise and patient all rolled up into one. Yaron, do you want to move to the next slide?
Yes, here we go.
I feel like the more hostile the questions, the more Josh has to try to praise me. So
I have a feeling after all these years, you can take it.
Well, the next two questions are somewhat tied, so I think you can take them together. One talks about is right in front of us. If you think that really the Middle East, given the recent agreement with the UAE and such promised normalization with other Arab countries, as Netanyahu has been talking about in recent days, has that changed anything? Is that making any option with peace with Palestinians under Palestinian Authority leadership anything viable? You somewhat addressed that already, I think, with respect to the status of the PA, which really is, as you said, the subcontractor of Israel. Anyone who knows the reality there knows that that's what the PA does, the dirty business Israel used to do until the end of the first Intifada, essentially. But the other question would be this, about saying, what would you say about the role of Palestinians in the current crisis? That is it not, that common Palestinian positions and their leadership make the solution that you present impractical?
Right. So look, on the UAE thing, I think it reduces, look, Benjamin Netanyahu didn't feel any sense of great urgency to change, to end Israeli control over the West Bank and Gaza as it was, and now he probably feels even less so. But I don't ultimately think that the UAE deal changes the fundamental realities. I mean, the realities, if you look at the history of this, as again, I'm sure Josh and you're basically, the Arab leaders have been, to use a non-Arabic phrase, stooping the Palestinians from time immemorial, right? I mean, even before the creation of Israel as a state, Israel in the Zionist leadership are making deals with Arab governments and leaders at the expense of the Palestinians. These are they're self-interested governments, and they don't, a lot of them care very much about the Palestinians. But the problem is, peace with the UAE or not, the Palestinians are still there. Right. And so unless the Arabs are going to actually take them, physically remove them from the territory, their presence, their existence is both a moral challenge for Israel, and I think also has the capacity to cause Israel enormous problems that the UAE cannot solve, right? Yaron just mentioned the first Intifada, right? The reason I think that you had the Madrid process and then the Oslo process was because the first Intifada in the late 1980s, when the Palestinians rose up after 20 years of relative quiescence, after Israel had taken over the West Bank in 1967, made Israel realize that the status quo was simply, the costs were too high. Israeli mothers were not, and fathers were not going to tolerate their 18 and 19-year-olds running through every Palestinian city and town and risking their own lives trying to put down a revolt. That was the problem the Palestinian Authority ultimately solved by basically, as Yaron said, having it do the dirty work. But if there's another uprising in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, it will show Israelis, and God willing, it will be a peaceful uprising. It will show Israelis that the costs for them of controlling millions of people who lack basic rights are things that can make their lives very, very difficult and uncomfortable. And the Emiratis, the emirs in the UAE are not going to be able to solve that problem for them. In terms of the Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian leadership is a basket case, but I think that my prognosis of my explanation of why or what it needs to be done about it might be different from some other folks. I think basically the PLO, which was designed to be the kind of the umbrella organization for Palestinians starting in the 1960s, has basically ceased to function. And you have no representative Palestinian leadership. You have a PA in the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank led by Mahmoud Abbas that hasn't held any elections. And so Abbas has become more and more corrupt and less legitimate, because that's what happens when people don't have to run for election. And similarly, Hamas in Gaza, right? If you want a legitimate Palestinian leadership that can actually represent Palestinians, and also that you could sit across the bargaining table with, that you could actually negotiate with, it has to have democratic legitimacy. It has to be replenished by Palestinians being able to kick out one group of people and bringing another group of people, right? And so ultimately, I think what both Israel and the United States haven't wanted that, because of course, if you allow Palestinians to elect their leaders, they may not elect the leaders you want. right? This is what happened in 2005 when Palestinians voted in the parliamentary elections that gave a plurality to Hamas, is that the Bush administration had been talking a lot about demanding that Palestinians embrace democracy. They held actually quite a free and fair election. They voted for Hamas. I mean, the exit polling shows quite clearly, because Fatah had been in power for 10 years and had been corrupt and had been hadn't gotten them towards a state, and there was a kind of lack of law and order. So they voted for the other guys. And then the Israelis and the Americans said, sorry, you don't have the right to vote for Hamas, right? Even though Israel has the right to vote for parties that don't support the two-state solution all the time, Palestinians don't have the right to vote for parties that support the two-state solution. So my view would be, you want a legitimate Palestinian leadership that you can potentially do business with and you can work with. It ultimately has to be one that's legitimate. The last point I would make is that I actually think the most interesting Palestinian leaders today are the Palestinian leaders inside Israel, the leaders of the Joint List, which is the Arab-Israeli coalition of parties. And I quote in my piece from Ayman Odeh, who's the leader of the Joint List. And I think that the vision that Ayman Odeh has, the way he talks about equality, the way he talks passionately about a place which is safe and free for both Jews and Palestinians, I actually think is the most inspiring vision we have right now among any Jewish or Palestinian leaders.
Peter, can you just elaborate a little bit? I often get, and I'm sure you do as well, people who say, you know what, Israel offered the Palestinians a state once or twice before, Palestinians turned it down, so what's the point now of proceeding? They had the chance, that kind of thing. How do you respond to people who say that to you?
So I think that it is true that let's say in 2000, during the Camp David negotiations, and then at Taba, and then again in 2007, 2008, when Ehud Olmert was negotiating with Mahmoud Abbas, that Israel made offers to the Palestinians that the Palestinians did not accept. But if that's where you stop, you are missing out on a lot of the story, right? The Palestinians also made offers that Israel did not accept. Right? I might say to you, Josh, you know what? I'm willing to buy your house for $500,000. And you say, no, you've rejected my offer. You say, I'll sell it to you for $1 million. And I say, no, I've rejected your offer, right? That is a much better approximation in my reading of what happened than this notion that basically Israel gave the Palestinians the moon, the stars, and the sun, and they said no. In reality, and if the only book, with all due respect, the only book you've read on this subject is Dennis Ross's book, it's not enough. Right? Because Dennis Ross's view is not even representative of all the American negotiators, let alone the academics who have worked on this, the Palestinians, and even some of the Israelis who worked on this. I'll try not to go on too long, but basically you have on each of these, the Israelis are always trying to annex somewhere between 6 and 10% of the West Bank. Why? Because they have big settlements there that they don't think they can evacuate, right? Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated before he tried to evacuate a single settlement. The Palestinians are always saying, look, we can't accept a 6-10% annexation because, first of all, some of these settlements create real contiguity problems. Look at a map and see how far Ariel stretches into the heart of the West Bank, for instance, cuts off the northern Palestinian cities from the rest of the West Bank. They're also saying, you can't compensate us for that much land inside the Green Line because you don't have enough land without people on it. Decent quality land to compensate it. So there's a difference in territory. The Palestinian offers are always for a 1 or 2% land swap. The Israelis are always talking about annexing 6 to 10%. The Israelis want to keep a military presence in the Jordan Valley. Barak supposedly wanted 12 years at Camp David. Netanyahu now talks about indefinitely. The Palestinians say if you keep the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, in what's 25% of the West Bank, the Jordan Valley, we don't really have sovereignty. The Palestinians want sovereignty over all the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. Barak was only willing to give them sovereignty over some. Then, of course, there's a huge question of refugees. It's not true the Palestinians have not compromised on refugees. Their leadership has made pretty significant compromises behind closed doors on refugees. For instance, suggesting 150,000 refugees that Assad Erekat, under the auspices of Mahmoud Abbas, proposed in the negotiations with Olmert. But that's still about 10 times or so what the Israelis are willing to suggest, right? So you basically have these gaps on all these issues. And I think it's important to understand that. And I think it runs counter to the storyline that we often hear in the Jewish community, essentially, which is we gave them everything they could have wanted and they said no.
Thanks. Yaron.
Right. Yes. Thank you. The next question. The next question was asking you about the comparison between Irish Catholics and Palestinians, and about the issue of Palestinians proving themselves as an equal partner, which I think you sort of addressed now in your last comment. So maybe you can just take the first part of this question, which is whether you see that comparison is valid. Others have made that comparison before, including, I forget, one of the American advisors who helped resolve the Irish struggle, and then thought that, I forgot his name.
Yeah, George Mitchell, who was
exactly, and then thought that he could, in the same methods, apply the same methods to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which of course didn't work.
Right. So I think that it's, it's interesting. I went back for this essay and I was reading, writing about the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, and the way it was perceived by written about in the British press in the 1980s, right? Remember, in the 1980s, the IRA is blowing up it's planting bombs all over England, right? I was a student at Oxford. When I got to Oxford in the early 1990s, there were still unexploded bombs left there by the IRA. Right. And if you look at the discussion of the IRA in the British press, especially the kind of more, nationalistic British press, it's that they are savages, they're barbarians, they're killing innocent women and children. Right now, in retrospect, we kind of tend to think of them in this kind of, sanitized way, but they were seen as as cold-blooded killers. And if you look at the way, it was commonplace among white South Africans, including members of my own family, to believe that if you gave Black South Africans the right to vote, that your maid was gonna butcher you in your sleep, right? And they didn't see we have now sanitized Nelson Mandela into this cuddly figure who believed in nonviolence. Bullshit. Nelson Mandela did not believe in nonviolence. Nelson Mandela was one of the key figures who turned the ANC towards embracing violence in the early 1960s. And he would not abandon, until he had a date for a free election, he refused to say that the ANC would abandon armed struggle. The ANC used to kill collaborators with something called the necklace, which they would perceived collaborators. What we get upset about what Palestinians do to perceived collaborators, they would take people, put a burning tire around their neck and set them on fire, right? These people seemed terrifying. Right. And the basic point that I try to make in my piece is that no group of people are saints. Right. But if you look at the Palestinian national movement, it's ironic because we tend to think about them as the most terrifying and bloodthirsty. Right. But to go back to your own sport, since the end of the Second Intifada in around 2005 or so, for the last 15 years, the Palestinian Authority has been working hand in glove with the Israeli army to make sure that Palestinians do not commit acts of terrorism against Israel, right? Even though they don't have freedom. If you had proposed that to Jerry Adams of the IRA or Nelson Mandela, that they would do security cooperation with the government that was denying their basic rights before they had basic rights, they would have laughed in your face. I actually don't think the Palestinian national movement has been especially mahmir, especially a hard line compared to a lot of its alternatives. And the basic argument that I make is that most people, Irish Catholic, Palestinian, Black South African, don't want to kill anyone or be killed themselves, right? People generally turn to violence because they feel like they have no alternatives. And so when people are given alternatives, the right to participate in their government and chance to make a better life for themselves without violence, generally that's what they prefer.
Peter, is there a phenomenon you see, and if so, how do you overcome it, where if the Palestinians are in a period of violence, like the Second Intifada, which, by the way, I was living in the West Bank during those 2 years of the Second Intifada in Beitar Illit, then Israel is very afraid of their security for good reason, and therefore they're in no mood to negotiate. But if PA is doing its job for Israel, and it's quiet for year after year after year, there's relatively little violence, a lot more violence against Palestinians actually than Palestinians against Israelis. Israelis don't feel the West Bank situation and busy living their lives. Their kids have trouble in meth and they have to get another kid has this problem and they need braces, and cottage cheese is too expensive because they're human beings who live their daily lives. Right. And this sort of push and pull that no matter which way it goes, it seems to sort of sit there and drag on.
Yeah. I mean,
and if so, how do you overcome that?
Right. So, there is this interesting book called The Only Language They Understand by, I'm playing his name now, who was the, it'll come to me, who was the International Crisis Group's representative. who argues actually, and it's a very provocative and disturbing argument. He basically argues that violence has worked. That Israel has actually given more to the Palestinians when they've committed violence than when they haven't committed violence. And he includes, and this is one of the things that the Palestinians will say, right? I mean, one of the reasons that Hezbollah has so much legitimacy, right, is that Israel left southern Lebanon after after Hezbollah had used violence, and the Palestinian Authority, who had been basically doing the security cooperation, didn't get a similar withdrawal from their peaceful means. Nathan Thrall is the author of that. But I guess I would say, since I could never in good conscience argue for the Palestinian use of violence, that the way I would hope that Palestinians would thread that needle, and that we and Jews would be part of that, would be for a nonviolent mass movement, a movement that essentially, imposed pressure, that showed Israel that the status quo is not, that showed that there would be costs for the status quo, right? Frederick Douglass famously said, power concedes nothing without a demand. So it made a demand, but it made the demand non-violently, and in a language of human rights, and even in a language of love, a language of saying, we don't want to drive you into the sea. We want to live alongside you, but we demand equality. And I will just say, and again, and this is why I would plead with people who have not, to read Palestinian writing. I mean, really anything. I mean, Edward Said, Yusuf Munayr, Ali Abu Nima, Noura Erakat, Raja Shahada, read, because I think that you may be surprised by the generosity of spirit that you encounter, in which you find people saying again and again, we demand equal rights, and we are also prepared to allow you to have equal rights. We demand safety and freedom, and we also demand that you have safety.
I just want to say, you missed Rashid Khalidi in that list of Palestinian authors of yours. But I just want to say that, first of all, on that last point, there might be an issue that, of course, if you read those Palestinian authors, you're reading the educated and the intellectuals, and you're not exposed to a large segment of the population that doesn't necessarily share their views. Rashid Khalidi admits in his work, even some of the things that are very hard for Palestinians to admit. For instance, that there were areas where Jews purchased land in Palestine in the early 20th century that were indeed vacant, that that did not involve the transplantation of Palestinian populations. This is not a very easy thing for a Palestinian author to admit. In other words, I think you're right that everyone has to read this. I think at least when I teach those topics, and some of my students are on this call now in my History of Israel class, and we definitely read Palestinian authors too. I think that's important. I guess the next question has to do with Gaza. And this was not a very good transition, but anyways, the next question has to do with Gaza, and about, really, I would say it asks you why are we responsible for what happens in Gaza if we pulled out? On the one hand, the question could be, if you say, okay, I evacuate this territory, comes in a new political entity that rejects my right to exist, why would I keep the borders open? Why would I be responsible for them? That's their problem that they reject my right to exist. But on the other hand, you could look at this and say, does this really matter if the demographic and humanitarian situation there is as you described earlier in your comments? So what's your take on the Gaza situation?
Yeah, and just to go what you're saying before you run, you make a good point. Obviously, look, Palestinians are not monolithic any more than Jews are monolithic. So, and I don't want to suggest that every Palestinian is Mahatma Gandhi. But I think, it's interesting. I mean, if you look at the work of Michael Melchior, right, Rabbi Michael Melchior, a former Israeli cabinet minister who devoted basically the last 20 years to deep engagement with members of the Muslim Brotherhood across the Arab world and in Hamas. Remember, Hamas is the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. I do think it's very striking that I would say much more often than not, not always, but much more often than not, I think a deep engagement with Palestinians, again, and these are the hardline Palestinians, right? This is Hamas, leads one to come away with the conclusion that Melchior has, which is that there's an openness to peace. And I think part of what happens is, we have this discourse where it's true in Israel, obviously, but even in the United States, where you just look like a naive, innocent idiot if you don't take the harshest view, right? So we all know about the Hamas Charter in 1988. It's a very vile document, right? It has protocols of the elders of Zion. It has anti-Semitism up the wazoo. And so everyone was always saying Hamas needs to change its charter, right? So in 2017, Hamas changes its charter, right? Does anyone even know that Hamas put out a new charter in 2017 that actually explicitly rejects anti-Semitism and says that Jews should have the right to live safely? Now, people will say, Beinart, come on, how naive can you be that you believe what Hamas wrote in its 2017 charter? Okay, but why is what they wrote in 1988 more accurate than what they wrote in 2017? My point is, we always tend to select, right, for the most frightening kind of thing that we're offered by Palestinians. Hamas has actually, again, I'm not a fan of Hamas, God knows, but they among other things, they blew up a bus that a friend of mine was on and killed him and his fiance. But Hamas leaders have said quite a few times over the last 15 years that if Israel returned to the 67 lines, they would accept a long-term truce. Right now, people say, "Oh, it's only a long-term truce. It's not acceptance of Israel's right to exist." It's true. North Korea and South Korea also have a long-term truce, right? But we, I think, tend to disregard this, and a lot of it doesn't even, I think, make it into our consciousness. So, in terms of the obligations, I guess I would just say, because I'm probably going on too long, I would say, listen, if you want to keep weapons out of Gaza, okay, I'm not going to argue with you about this, that you can have some kind of international, you can have, as long as we're in the situation we're in now, that Israel can have some kind of regime where it checks for weapons going into Gaza, and that you can have some kind of international standards about dual use technologies, right? But what I think the standards of the status quo have to explain is, why can't people in Gaza export tomatoes and potato chips, right? Why can't someone in Gaza go to her grandmother's funeral in the West Bank? Why can't a student in Gaza leave Gaza and go to university somewhere, right? I mean, I actually was supposed to go to Gaza earlier this year, right? I can tell you, you need Israeli permission to go into Gaza, and it's very, very difficult to get. Right. And so this is, it seems to me, a form of collective punishment that I think is not morally justified. And not only that, I don't think it's smart. Right. It's not ultimately, as I said at the beginning, in Israel's long-term best interest, it seems to me, to make people more and more desperate and to make their lives more and more horrific. I ultimately think that's not leading, given the fact that those people are not very far away from you, and that we live in a world where technology may give them all kinds of new avenues, God forbid, of taking retribution. I don't think it's a wise, smart-term strategy. And I think, by and large, that it is the Israeli security establishment in general, which generally tends to be to the left of the Israeli political leadership, that often tends to be the folks that are making this point.
Thanks, Peter. And I think Peter also addressed the issue of the occupation, the way that Israel controls Gaza earlier on as well. Yaron, I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up.
Yes.
The one that you find most...
Yes, because this last question sort of ties into many of the issues you discussed. And I admit it's also a personal interest of mine. And the issue is really a question of demographic or demographics. And I don't have, I'm not sure how to answer this question. So maybe you can help us out. The issue of really, okay, if we say we apply the solution that you propose right now, I don't think it's going to be so tragic as some people, perhaps even on this call, would envision it to be. Even if you take into consideration the Haredim, who are probably reproducing at about the same rate as Palestinians, we probably have a few decades to go until this horrific scenario of Jews being a minority in their own state would actually take place. But let's say that it does take place. If you look around at traditions, and I'm expanding on this question, but I got it in different versions from a few people. If we look at versions or the experience of democracy and governance anywhere in the Arab world, you don't have an example of a functioning democracy with all its problems, still a functioning democracy as Israel is today. So what is to guarantee that that these things would continue? In other words, that the state that would emerge, that inevitably at some point would not be the same Israel that it is today, by the solution that you're proposing, would become still a flourishing, functioning democracy where couples can, show affection wearing not too many clothes on the beach as they do today in Tel Aviv.
So I guess this is the last question. Let me just first start by thanking Josh and Yaron again, and also thanking all of you who came. I gather from the questions that there are a lot of folks who quite strongly disagree with me, and I want to just particularly say how grateful I am to all of you for putting yourself through this sorus of listening to someone you strongly disagree with. I actually think, it's kind of rare. People generally show up, maybe it's a credit to Josh and Yaron, but generally people show up and just listen to people who they tend to already agree with, both in the Jewish world and beyond. And I think that we're, and people on the left are as guilty of that as people on the right. So it seems to me, are setting an example for all of us. It says in Pirkei Avot, who is wise? The one who learns from all people. So it seems to me that's what you're doing. So and I'm grateful to you for that. And it's something I will try to take to heart myself. On this question about becoming a minority, I guess again I would rephrase it. I would reframe it a little bit. If you believe, as I do, that there already is a one-state reality, then it's quite plausible, likely, that Jews are going to be the minority. Because the Palestinian birth rate is probably a bit higher anyway, right? The question is really, I think, to me, less about whether Jews are going to be a minority or not, is whether Jews are going to lose some political power because everybody's going to actually have the right to vote, so that if there are more Palestinians than Jews, those Palestinians could outvote Jews, right? It doesn't matter so much if Palestinians are a majority, if most of them don't have the right to vote, right? So that's, I think, the danger, really, ultimately. It's some losing of political power. And I understand why this is frightening for Jews in particular, right, who have taken the lesson, as many in my own family did, that Jews are never want to be in a situation where they don't have political power anymore. But I also think it's worth remembering that every group that I can think of that has had basic rights and lived alongside a group that doesn't have basic rights, whether it was whites in the American South or white South Africans or Protestants in Northern Ireland, all generally have this existential fear of what it will mean to give up political power. And throughout all of these communities, even those who have not had to suffer what Jews have suffered historically, they have this apocalyptic sense of what's likely to happen if they give up the political power they have. What I argue in my piece is that not that this one state would not be messy or challenging or difficult in lots of ways, but that it's very unlikely to be apocalyptic for Jews. First of all, Jews, think of, again, there are differences, of course, between South Africa and Israel, but it's worth remembering that white South and South Africa are about now 10%, 12% of the population, right? But their economic power has allowed them to maintain a striking degree of privilege, even in a government where they are outvoted by massive amounts, right? Let's even say the Jewish population goes down to 40%. We know from our own country and many other countries that economic power translates to political power. A Jewish population which would remain economically privileged, certainly in the short term, would be able to safeguard its interest very, very significantly, even if it did not have a numerical majority. you also have a very strong diaspora Jewish population, much stronger diaspora connection than, let's say, white South Africans had, which I think would factor in. Again, as I said before, I think that the reason that there are some Arab countries like Tunisia now that are democratic, others that have some forms of democracy. But the basic reason that I think it is mistaken to extrapolate from the Arab world to what an equal Israel-Palestine would be is, as I said earlier on, that there are a set of conditions that exist in Israel-Palestine, whether it's per capita income, literacy rate, a set of institutions, the strength of the state, all of which leads to me to believe that the trajectory would be very, very different than the trajectory of the post-colonial Arab states. Again, in some ways analogous to how different the trajectory of post-apartheid South Africa has been to post-colonial Black states. I cannot claim, I have no guarantees. I can't predict the future. I can't say that there could not be very significant challenges. There could be, but it's worth noting that if you look at the 20% of Israel's population inside the Green Line that are Palestinian now, we call them Arab Israelis, but they're Palestinians, right? This is not just a group. Again, we have these notions about what Arabs are like, maybe some of these notions about the women. If you look at public opinion data, and I go through some of it in my piece, Palestinian citizens of Israel are the most committed group to the principles of liberal democracy that exist in Israel. By every metric, virtually more committed than Israeli Jews. And I think that should lead us to rethink some of the notions that we have, these kind of essentialist cultural notions about Arabs and Palestinians. We should also look at the visions that Palestinian leaders themselves are offering. Read Palestinian one-state writing, read Ali Abu Nima, read Yusuf Munayyer, read Edward Said, read the documents put forward by Palestinian intellectuals. You will see that what they are asking for, what they are demanding is a liberal democracy with the rule of law. That's why they don't want to live in an Arab dictatorship. They want to live in a country which respects the rule of law.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yaron, for gathering the questions and typing them so efficiently, and Peter for being with us tonight. If nothing else, we have a takeaway certainly to think about the reality on the ground in new ways, and to think about the possibilities for the future in new ways. And as you said, not everyone's going to walk away and agree with you 100%, but hopefully it's at least a challenge to think in new ways, which is what we're hoping for at the center. So thank you so much for that. I know you have a busy evening. For those who don't know, Peter, like as I once was, but have fallen out, is a devotee of Daf Yomi, of learning a page of Talmud every day. And for those who don't know, we are currently in the Tractate of Eruvin, which is considered one of the two most difficult tractates in the entire Talmud. And I crushed my teeth on it 7.5 years ago, and I pity you a little bit, but I hope you enjoy the journey, and good luck with that. And thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and hope to see you in other events that our program is offering this semester. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.